All right, welcome everyone to the Why Carbon Pricing Won't Solve the Climate Crisis webinar. In just a minute, we're going to dive in and hear all about carbon pricing. Again, my name is Rebecca Wolf from Food and Water Watch, Food and Water Action, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers with us tonight, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Wanted to say thank you for joining us, and I'd also like to thank our allies and partners who have shared this webinar with their networks, especially National Nurses United, People's Action, Progressive Democrats of America, and People Demanding Action. And a special thank you to our speakers and their organizations as well, Friends of the Earth, Indigenous Environmental Network, and People Demanding Action. So again, before we get started, just a quick orientation if you're on Zoom with us. So it's a good time to mention that if you aren't joining us on screen share, once again, we really do recommend that by clicking the link in your email. We're here on video so you can see all of our faces, and we're also sharing slides for the webinar. We will be keeping everyone on mute, so don't worry if you have some background noise. We just want to make sure that everyone can hear the speakers, but we will be taking questions throughout. If you have a question at any point in the presentation, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can throughout and at the end of the webinar. I will also note that we're not using the raise hand function at the bottom as well. So again, just click that Q&A if you want to ask a question. And if you have any technical issues or you're joining us over the phone and have questions, you can email us at help@fwaction.org. That's HELP at F as in fish, W as in water, action.org. And with that, let's dive into our program for tonight. So just kind of to introduce us, I can confidently say, that everyone on this call knows that scientists are telling us that we need to rapidly transition to renewable energy if we want to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. We know that big oil companies, utilities, and even some nonprofits and environmental organizations have really come together to support carbon pricing policies as a solution to our climate emergency. Though on taking a deeper look at these pricing policies, which promote carbon taxes, cap and trade, and pollution offsets, we see some significant problems. And we have brought together experts who have taken a really deep look at these policies to share some of these concerns directly with you. These concerns range from increasing pollution in historically overburdened communities to promoting fracking and nuclear energy. And probably the most concerning of these policies is that they're really not effective at addressing the climate crisis. And they're a distraction from some really common sense policies like Tulsi Gabbard's National Off Act that will end the use of fossil fuels and transition the US to 100% renewable energy by 2035. So I'll kick some of this off with introductions and then pass it off to our panelists for tonight. First up, we have Scott Edwards, who is co-director of the Food and Water Justice Project. He's prosecuted US energy companies in Canadian courts for contamination of waterways and has been very active against factory farms in both North Carolina and the Chesapeake region. He's based in New York and has a leading role in our policy concerns about marketizing pollution. Then we have Tamara Gilbertson. She's a research associate on carbon pricing with the Indigenous Environmental Network. She was a co-founder and co-director of Carbon Trade Watch and former project coordinator of the Environmental Justice Project. She has over 15 years of experience collaborating with a wide range of networks working towards social, environmental, and climate justice. We have Gary Hughes with Friends of the Earth, who works on climate, energy, forest, and water issues and has extensive domestic experience in the western states of the US and has worked throughout Latin America as well. And prior to working with Friends of the Earth, Gary was with the Environmental Protection Information Center in the Redwood Temperate Forests of Northern California, and as Patagonia campaign coordinator with International Rivers. Quite a list. And then finally, last but not certainly least, we have Andrea Miller. She is the executive director of People Demanding Action, a multi-issue advocacy group. Her personal issues include climate justice, voting rights, Medicare for all, trade, and of course, the Equal Rights Amendment. Andrea is both a community organizer and a digital advocacy expert. She is on the steering committee of Interfaith Moral Action on climate and hosted the Progressive Roundtable. And in 2008, Andrea was actually the Democratic nominee for Congress from Virginia's 4th District. And I've only just summarized, even though extensively, some of the incredible work that all of these speakers have done. And I want to thank them all for all of their great work that they do every day, as well as for being with us here tonight. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Scott Edwards from Food and Water Watch Action to kick us off.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to try to share my screen here. So let's see if I can get this right. Is that working? Let's see. How's that?
Looks great.
Was it? Okay. So yes, thanks for joining us. Certainly this is a critical issue, and I think everybody on this webinar tonight understands how critical climate change is. I do want to start off though talking a little bit about another climate crisis another crisis we face, an environmental crisis we faced in this country, and that was about 50 years ago in the 1960s, when after decades of very intense industrial activity, our airways, our waterways, our land systems were all under a significant threat from industrial activity. Heavy loads of pollution, industrial activity, poisoning our waterways, poisoning our airways. Our cities were becoming unlivable. There were massive fish kills all around the country. And our rivers were bursting into flames. And we were certainly at a crisis point, and I won't compare it exactly to the climate crisis we're now facing, but it was certainly an environmental crisis that demanded attention from everybody in this country and from our elected political leaders. And you know, there were demonstrations all over the country. There were demands that our government step up and do what was needed in order to remedy our problem. And luckily, we had a Congress back then, starting in the late 1960s and into the 70s, that actually took decisive action to address these environmental crises that we were facing. From 1969 to 1980, there were 18 major environmental and public health and safety laws enacted by the US Congress. And it was a decisive decade for our elected leaders to take action to address what we were facing in our communities from all these pollutants that we were being exposed to. There was one thing that many of these laws, not all of them, but certainly a lot of them, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all the hazardous waste material laws that we passed, the Endangered Species Act, they all had in common. They had very strict mandates about what industry could do, how much they could discharge, what happens when they went over their limits. They were shut down, they were fined. These were strict regulatory controls on levels of pollution. And they were highly successful. They weren't perfect, right? The Clean Water Act hasn't cleaned up all of our waterways. The Clean Air Act, there are still cities that are suffering from poor air quality, certainly. So they weren't perfect, but they were extremely effective. And through the 70s and 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, we've done a wonderful job turning around a lot of our environmental problems that we had in this country with water and air. And again, there's more work to do, certainly. But again, they all had in common strict limits on what industry could do in terms of discharging their pollutants. We're now 50 years later, and we are facing a different crisis, a more dire crisis, I think, with climate. Certainly, we're threatening the very existence of this planet. But we're no longer looking to do what we did back in the 1970s and demand that industry do what's needed to do to stop polluting with carbon and with other greenhouse gases. There is a wonderful op-ed that came out in 2015 by a Yale professor, an environmental law professor, who was talking about a shift in attitude he was seeing among many of the young people that he was teaching. And he called it desperate environmentalism. And I'll just quote some of what he said in that op-ed, because I think it's a critical indicator of where we're at now and how we've changed from where we were 50 years ago when we passed these critical laws like the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. He says, "We're turning away from enforceability-based approaches and promote more conservative techniques that we hope will impress and persuade reticent, and cynical policymakers and power brokers. If this is environmentalism at all, it is desperate environmentalism, characterized not by awe, enthusiasm, and enjoyment of nature, but by appeasement. It relies on utilitarian efficiencies, cost-benefit analyses, private sector indulgences, and anthropocentric division of natural resources. And I think that sums up well what our new philosophy seems to be in the United States when it comes to tackling some of these real difficult questions like environmental pollution and climate change. We have moved very much to the right in this country, and both political parties are embracing this notion of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a movement that looks to economics, looks to market-based systems, looks to deregulate all of our environmental laws and all of our industries, that looks to privatize. We are now seeing this huge shift away from the regulatory systems that have proven successful in public health and safety and environmental health. And we're moving into this new realm of pure market-based systems. And what neoliberalism does is it places the burden on consumers instead of on industry and on government to fix our problems. It basically says to consumers, you can shop your way out of all of our problems, just make the right choices. The problem with neoliberalism is it creates a hugely, as I said, undue burden on consumers, but it also creates massive inequities because consumers don't control the choices that we have. It's industry and government and policies that control these things. Neoliberalism has resulted in the last 40 years in massive income inequality, in injustice and environmental injustice. There are many people who say that it's neoliberalism that put Trump into power. So we think it's a dangerous place to go when we start looking at our policies. We look back to regulation and the things that we did in the 1970s to clean up our rivers and our airways. And that's what we should be doing now with climate change. From just an efficacy perspective, though, on these pricing systems, I mean, there are two basic pricing systems to deal with carbon. One is cap and trade, and the other are carbon taxes. And I'm going to discuss just very rapidly, because I don't have a lot of time, both of those approaches. Cap and trade is in essence a industry-wide cap on emissions. And what cap and trade says is, well, if you have this overall cap, then individual facilities within that cap can then create this free market system of trading allowances, trading credits, pollution credits around. It's been going on for the longest time in the European Union for about 12 years now. But in the United States, the big cap and trade program that you probably all heard about has been going on in California. I know Gary's going to talk about the California program in a little bit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But if you look at carbon emissions under the California cap and trade program, there's no evidence that that program has resulted in any greenhouse gas emissions reductions at all. It's only been in place since 2013. I'll give it that, right? So it's only been about 5 years. But again, a recent report that just came out last year on that system said that according to analyses from the Air Board and independent experts, the emissions drops, any emission drops that exist, and you'll see on a graph if you're on the video here, that there have been minimal emissions drops since 2012, but the reports are saying that any emission drops don't come from technological breakthroughs or pollution reductions from the cap and trade program, but it has more to do with weather. There was increased rain, increased use of hydroelectric. So there's no real tie between anything that's happening in California with cap and trade and what's happening with greenhouse gas emissions. What is happening, though, in California on the cap and trade program is that a 2016 study out of Berkeley found that many facilities, many industry sectors were actually using the system to increase their discharges of pollutants into environmental justice frontline communities of color. So what's happening under this cap and trade program, and what we think is inherent in these cap and trade programs, are industries who are, because of siting, are typically located in these frontline communities, are using this pay to pollute system to actually increase discharges into these environmental justice communities. This report came out in 2016. In 2017, the California Cap and Trade Program was up for renewal, and we and many environmental justice groups and others were fighting against it. Governor Brown and some of the big green groups in California jumped right on board and re-implemented the program, even in the light of this 2016 report that showed that these environmental justice communities were being poisoned by the program. The other big cap and trade program you'll hear about is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that a lot of the Northeast states have joined, New York, certainly New Jersey's rejoining, Virginia's contemplating joining right now. And it suffers from a lot of the same impacts, but I want to focus on one problem with RGGI, and that is that a lot of the RGGI proponents say that, well, CO2 emissions have gone down under RGGI since the program was implemented in 2009. And that's in fact true, and we can talk a little bit later about why those may have gone down. But what they don't talk about is that RGGI only measures CO2 emissions and not methane emissions. And what's happened in RGGI states, and you can see from this graph, again, if you're online here, is that what these states have done, states like New York and other RGGI states, they've stopped using coal and they're now using natural gas. And you can see the jump from 2005 up to 2015 in natural gas consumption in these states. They're up to over 40% for their energy generation. The problem there is natural gas emits massive amounts of methane. And RGGI doesn't account for methane. Methane is 86 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas emission over short-term periods. And we've actually recently crunched the numbers, adding in the greenhouse gas impacts from methane. You can see again from this graph, if you factor in the methane from the increased use of gas in RGGI states, we're not seeing reductions in greenhouse gases overall. It's basically flatlining. This is not a climate plan. This is not going to save our planet. This is the status quo. If we continue on programs like this, we are in deep trouble from a climate perspective. Carbon tax. I know there are a lot of folks here in favor of a carbon tax. There's been a lot of political discussion about carbon tax on both the left and the right. Again, it's a little bit different than cap and trade, but it's still a market-based program that seeks to put a price on carbon, and through that price, impact the way consumers react in the marketplace and how they purchase cars and home fuel oil and so on. The big carbon tax experiment in North America was in British Columbia, where in the middle of 2008, the province implemented a carbon tax, raised the tax every year from 2008 to 2012, and then didn't raise it, but it's still in place. We pulled all the emissions data from British Columbia. We have a report online that you could look at that looked at all taxed emissions. British Columbia did not reduce their greenhouse gas emissions at all. As a matter of fact, and again, in the graph, you'll see that when we compared emissions from taxed sources in the province with untaxed sources, it was untaxed sources that dropped very insignificantly. But tax sources actually went up under the carbon tax. And that's because when you stick, 10 cents, 50 cents, 60 cents, $1, $2 per gallon on gas, which is typically how the tax manifests itself at the end of the supply chain, people don't stop buying gas. There's lots of studies out there from the Energy Information Agency that shows that things like gas, home fuel oil, they don't react well to the marketplace. They're basically inelastic. People need to drive their cars. People need to heat their homes. So perhaps at some point you get to hundreds of dollars on carbon tax and $20 on a gallon of gas that might have impacts. At these kinds of numbers, you're not seeing any kinds of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. I know there are a lot of CCL supporters on the call tonight, and we've received lots of questions from CCL folks about that fee and dividend plan. That fee and dividend plan is a carbon tax. It's a revenue neutral carbon tax. Again, based on the British Columbia model, we're not confident that any carbon tax that's being contemplated right now will result in emissions reductions. However, I do want to point out something that's very important on the CCL plan, and on the REMI study. We've gotten some questions specifically about the REMI study. If you look on page 40 of the REMI study, you will find a graph that shows the energy mix contemplated by CCL out through, and they projected out through 2040. And again, for those who are online, you can see that the graph in front of you, the orange, both the orange striped and the solid orange and the red lines represent gas, natural gas, fracking, and the red is nuclear power. You will see that under CCL's program and under their projection through 2040, about half of the energy, little less than half of the energy in this country they project should come and will come from nukes and frack gas. And that's because, again, they're only looking at CO2 and coal. They're not looking at other energy sources. You know, we don't want to see at Food and Water Watch an energy future that relies on nukes. We don't want to see an energy future that relies on fracking. And fracking will have, again, just as it is having in Reggie states, a dramatic impact on climate. So we don't think that that's a path forward either. We don't have time really to experiment with pricing systems and pricing mechanisms. We're not confident they'll work. We're afraid that if we sit back and wait for taxes and cap and trade systems, and we wait 10 years, 20 years, 30 years to see what's going to happen with these things, it will be too late. We're already reaching perhaps tipping points, and we have very few years left in our carbon budget. We think we know what works, and Andrea is going to talk about those in a little bit, so I'll end here. But we really don't have a lot of confidence in pricing systems. We think they'll actually do more harm than good if they're enacted, because they're going to foreclose the real solutions we need to fix our climate problem, and that is mandated regulations, as we did back in the 1970s. And I'll leave it with that. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Scott. Wanted to give folks just a quick reminder that we'll be emailing out the recording to the webinar, as well as any of the resources that you see that we cover. So if you have any questions for Scott, be sure to pop them in the Q&A, again, at the bottom of your screen. You can also email them to help@fwaction.org. And now I'll turn it over to Tamara.
Hear me? Yeah? Hello? Yeah.
Sound
okay.
great. You sound great. Yep.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to Food and Water Watch for setting this up. It's a really great initiative. Thanks for inviting everyone. And thanks to Scott for a really great introduction and overview. So I don't have slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit, and I want to go into kind of more of a little bit of the history. And to set up a few points that I want to make at the end, sort of 4 points I want to get to. But in order to do that, I think it's really important to make a few points about the history of carbon trading, cap and trade, offsets, and tax schemes, and that this is not a new debate. This is not something that's just begun. This is something that's been going on for decades, really, and the trajectory of it. And building off of what Scott was saying, it's sort of been born through neoliberalism and not from the direct regulation programs in the 70s, and very much pushed by U.S. government, including Al Gore in the 1990s, sort of following through the 1990s neoliberal approach to free trade agreements and opening up borders and development initiatives at the time. So what I want to talk about is a little bit going back from the Kyoto Protocol in the late 90s, when that was first set up, and how that was sort of a plan at that point to really set up a global system. And it wasn't necessarily it was said to reduce climate change. It wasn't necessarily to reduce climate change. It was more sort of to capitulate and create a system whereby polluters could have more power and structure over how emissions were handled on an international level. And this is really clear if you look back through some of the earlier pieces that were written from the UN, World Bank, and different like international financial institutions at the time that have been very involved and still are very involved in these processes. It was envisioned to be, you know, an international scheme. And it was, and it has been, and it still is moving that way. But there's pieces here that are really important to look at. So one is the European emissions trading system that was set up through the Kyoto Protocol, and it was set up in a way that was designed to include many countries. And it failed miserably somewhere right after the financial crisis of 2008. So, you know, at that point, you know, it was sort of limping along. There were all these different pieces and parts put in place, like state-led backloading programs in the European emissions trading scheme, the CDM pollution permits, or the clean development mechanism, which is the largest offset program under the Kyoto Protocol. They're still nearly worthless today, despite a voluntary cancellation program, an Australian carbon track scheme that would have then sort of segued into a cap and trade or a carbon market, and by 2015 was completely canceled. And so somewhere around 2014, after everything kind of started to fall apart on an international level, you know, it was really sort of called into question. People were starting to say, oof, maybe this isn't working. And I remember myself being at a conference in 2015 and somebody coming up to me and saying, wow, you know, I've read some of your stuff and so that must feel great. You guys were right. And I remember thinking, no, really? Like, I just didn't, you know, that can't be right. I wasn't thinking of it like that. And I was right not to think of it like that, because of course, you know, the story doesn't end there. So by September 2014, 74 countries, 23 states, provinces, and cities, and over 1,000 businesses and multinational corporations, investors, banks, with more than $24 trillion, and trillion I say with a T, and assets, you know, they met to discuss a series of initiatives to price carbon. And, you know, this was announced at the UN Secretary General's Climate Leadership Summit. Of course, the World Bank was there. It was hosted by the World Bank Group and the World Economic Forum and the newly formed We Mean Business Coalition. And it resulted in a letter, sort of a statement. It was called Put a Price on Carbon. And it was signed by California Governor Jerry Brown, the Prime Minister of Vietnam, among others. And of course, some of the biggest polluters in the world, including Unilever, Eon, Holcim, PG&E, and many others. And the impetus for large corporations and governments and the UN and World Bank, you know, to push forward the carbon pricing schemes at the time was in order to bridge together carbon trading schemes, like big cap and trade schemes, with carbon pricing schemes, all kinds of carbon pricing schemes, including Carbon-Fee-and-Dividend. So underneath a large umbrella that they could just call carbon pricing. And in that way, there were sort of two strategies that I see on their part. One is that there had been a lot of backlash against carbon trading. And so they needed to almost, in a way, sort of rebrand it. And another sort of piece of that as well was how they could then bridge those two things together. Now, this was not a new idea either. I remember being in Bali at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2008, I think it was, 10 years ago. And IETA, the International Association on, Trading Pollution, I can't remember, had issued a briefing that said, the goal is to create a global carbon trading system. That's the goal. That's the goal of the World Bank. That's the goal of the big emissions trading systems. That's the goal of the international financial institutions. That is the goal of neoliberalism, is to put a price on carbon, put a price on pollution. And that way, the largest polluters in the world have more control over how it is handled, how it is managed, how it is dealt with. Putting a price on something, with a cute price collar means that actually corporate control is far more easy. And so the vice president of the World Bank Group at the time, her name was Rachel Kite, she went on to state, and I quote, she said, "We're seeing a shift towards the economic architecture that will be necessary to avoid a 2-degree warmer world," unquote. And the architecture here that she's referring to was to link carbon trading systems and taxes on a global scale under a big and to preserve and increase the flexibility enjoyed by large polluting industries, so that powerful industrialized states as well in the global north could also have more control in handling pollution and the so-called climate crisis. Now, with that said, by the end of last year, there were 46 national and 26 subnational jurisdictions that had implemented carbon pricing initiatives, ranging from all different types of carbon trading systems and all different types of carbon tax systems. So it's, it's well on its way, right? Now, with that in mind, I want to make 4 points here, and then I'll wrap it up. I'm not sure, how much time do I have, Rebecca?
Yes, you got about a minute left, so.
Okay, I'm actually getting to my points. Okay,
Perfect.
Then I'll make them relatively quickly and we can come back to them. The first one is that whether we're talking about carbon taxes or cap and trade systems or any of the other manifestations, we're talking about doing something after the fact, after the pollution has been taken out of the ground, right? After the fossil fuels have been taken out of the ground. So the whole exploration phase has been done, the well tapping has been done, the mining has been done, the infrastructure has been set up, whether we're talking about trains or ports, the workers have been exploited, the pollution and that whole process is already out there, the transportation has been done. And as whether we're talking about, gas, oil, or coal, or uranium for that matter, once it gets to the processing phase and somebody wants to set a tax on it, a huge amount of that destruction is already done. So, we're talking about not actually stopping or keeping fossil fuels underground. We're talking about a Band-Aid. Secondly, when we talk about taxes or cap and trade schemes, corporations know exactly how to deal with taxes and pricing mechanisms because they've been doing it for years. There's a whole chapter in the publication that I wrote with the Indigenous Environmental Network and Climate Justice Alliance in chapter 4, where we talk exactly about how tax subsidies and tax breaks are well-versed. The fossil fuel industry is well-versed in how to deal with that. So yeah, tax the crap out of them. Give the money to the people who need it most. But we're not talking, that's not a solution to climate change. And it's certainly not a solution to climate justice. So what we're talking about is trying to stop climate change and deal with the inequalities that are inherent in market-based systems and neoliberal systems, like all forms of carbon pricing. And that's not going to be addressed through a pittance, like a carbon tax or anything like that. It's not designed to do that, and it's not designed to fail the revenue. So the third point I want to make is that there is no guarantee that communities are going to receive revenue, even if there is a tax or even if there is a cap and trade system that sets aside that type of money. I've interviewed many architects including an architect of the RGGI system. He said basically the money ended up as a cookie jar for the governor of one of the states. It ended up being a sort of, woof, what are we going to do to fix that bridge? Well, oh yeah, we have that extra money over there. And that's kind of, what happened. This is easily fraudulent. And also, when communities do get any sort of financial kickbacks, it often comes in the form of maybe another bus stop in their community. But cities and governments should be making sure that public services are happening anyway. And so, sort of be creating this dependency revenue on fossil fuels is not a solution to dealing with public health crises or public services crises in communities of color or poor communities or communities who are receiving the injustices of climate change. And finally, I want to say that, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, but creating revenue for the most poor. And ultimately, you know, this sort of polluter pays slogan, or looking at it like a polluter pays solution, it doesn't distinguish between, you know, like fraud or fines and fees. And it's often, you know, it's sort of like creates, it continues an enclosure of the commons. So it ends up being traded as something else. And it's done in the name, of sort of, you know, creating this revenue for the poor, but I would just have to say, I find it really patronizing, because communities of color and environmental justice communities, they know what they need. They have agency, they have solutions, they have great ideas. And the idea that sort of like creating some sort of way to make people's electricity bill a little bit easier by taxing large multinational corporations that are generating billions and billions of dollars is in the wrong direction. You know, and it's something that Indigenous people have often fought against, this idea of this sort of patronizing elitist Band-Aid solution. And none of these carbon pricing systems even begin to address the harsh reality of what we're dealing with in terms of carbon trading, in terms of climate change, and certainly in terms of climate justice. So I think I've gone over. I'm gonna leave it there. I have a lot of other points to make. I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, that's okay. That's great. I think some of the questions that folks had actually written in and asked of you, you touched on a bunch of those. So I think that's great. And thanks to Tamara for representing the Indigenous Environmental Network tonight and sharing those great 4 points with us. Just a quick reminder, I know people are jumping in and out. We've got people hopping on, hopping off. So if you have just joined us, welcome. Please chat your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're using the Q&A button, not the chat button, not the hand raised button. That's a little bit easier to use, so we're using that one. As well as you can email us at help@fwaction.org. And I will quickly pass it off to Gary from Friends of the Earth.
All right, thank you so much, Rebecca. And I guess I just want to check and make sure that people can hear me. Can I get an affirmative that, okay, great.
Well, great. Yep.
Nice. Well, you know, tremendous appreciations to Food and Water Watch for pulling this together, and all the other panelists, and definitely appreciate the fact that everyone has tuned in this evening. I'm going to try to be really brief. Just want to start by being really clear that Friends of the Earth is currently re-examining our position on carbon taxes. We're taking a really close look at what these market mechanisms really mean. The last year has resulted in a lot of soul searching. We've always been extremely skeptical and critical of carbon trading, especially as it relates to offsets. So my comments tonight are going to focus on our experience engaging on the development and evolution of the California Cap and Trade program, and in particular what we have observed and learned as we have communicated concerns regarding proposals in California to further expand the carbon market to include international sector-based offsets, that is tropical forest-based offsets, also known as red offsets. So as we've pulled on this loose thread, as it were, of California's endeavor to expand the market to include red offsets, we've engaged really deeply on the policymaking around cap and trade. And this first slide, really I want to go to the heart of what we believe is a really major problem with the reauthorization last summer of the cap and trade program. And essentially the passage of AB 398 last summer was a blow to environmental justice worldwide. And in particular, it has to do with the preemption of local action and basically the establishment of this preeminence of the market as the sole mechanism for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from stationary sources, such as petroleum refineries and oil and gas production facilities. By limiting the authority of local air pollution regulators, this legislation is a direct attack on what have proven to be effective grassroots efforts at the local level to hold polluters accountable for their destruction of the global climate and their poisoning of California's communities. This passage of the deal last summer basically totally upended efforts here in the San Francisco Bay Area by grassroots groups with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District to put strict caps on the emissions from the refineries. And so this was a very sobering moment, and we continue to look really hard at these issues. Now, as I said, we have looked really deeply at the social justice implications and the erroneous assumptions around the tropical forest offsets type schemes. And what that led us to was to look very closely at what's going on with California forests. And the truth about greenhouse gas emissions from industrial forestry in California is that the emissions coming from silviculture applications, from logging, a lot of it being clear-cut logging, are equal probably to about half of the emissions from electricity generation in the state. But there's no inventory of this, and the state has done nothing to really look at and quantify the greenhouse gas emissions from industrial forestry in California. And this is a real problem on a lot of different fronts, most explicitly because of the reliance on forest offsets within the California cap and trade program. But what we know is that carbon density on the landscape in California continues to decline. This is from decades of industrial exploitation of the forest. But we also know that California's forests are fire evolved. We know that California's forests are not linear and static repositories of carbon. We know that they are naturally volatile, and that we also know that now with climate change isn't igniting fires, but we know that climate change is changing the way that fires behave. So California's climate policy, and the market in particular, seems to rely upon a myth that somehow our forests are going to scrub the atmosphere of the greenhouse gas emissions that we're creating by burning fossil fuels. And there could be nothing further from the truth. And so one of our basic criticisms of the carbon pricing mechanism that is implemented in California with the cap and trade program is that there's a real paucity of climate science. And essentially what we've seen is that there's been a conflation of the fossil carbon that is mobilized with the extraction and then emitted with the burning of fossil fuels, with that carbon that is involved with biological processes. That's a biocarbon, as we can call it. They're two totally different carbon cycles, and this conflation and creating a homogeneous, tradable carbon commodity is not based on science. And this is where we're starting to have tremendous concerns about how this is playing out in California, because if the point of any policy is to respond to the climate threat, we need to make sure that it's based on the best climate science. And this is really what California's cap and trade program is missing, and what the regulators refuse to address, and what the polluters love to take refuge in. And they are taking refuge in it. These are the most recent stats around crude oil supplies in California. And as you notice, in 2017, there was actually another spike in crude oil refining in California. 2017, we saw the second largest amount of crude oil going through the refineries since the Great Recession. So this is of tremendous concern, and it also raises questions about how California is going to handle this in the future, because California in 2017 also set a record for the amount of crude oil coming from foreign sources to be refined in the facilities here in California that are all regulated under cap and trade. And I'd like to point out a couple of numbers here that people might not be aware of, but that 1 in 6 barrels of oil that was refined in California in 2017 came from the Western Amazon. And this is a contradiction that we've pointed out many times to the regulators here in the state, who have been promoting the integration of a tropical forest-based offset into the California cap and trade program, because it's often cloaked and presented as like, well, California wants to use this market mechanism to do something about saving tropical forests. But we've pointed out time and time again that if California wants to do something about tropical forests, we need to do all we can to reduce and eliminate our use of crude oil coming from tropical forest areas. We know that oil exploration and extraction is one of the leading causes of deforestation, and tropical deforestation is also one of the leading causes globally of climate change. And how this is playing out at home now is that we do have refineries that are maintaining and even increasing their emissions. And in particular, one instance I want to bring to everyone's attention, that the cap and trade program is really basically facilitating. It allows these kinds of changes to happen. And this is the Phillips 66 refinery, the Rodeo here on San Francisco Bay. And they are currently moving forward in an attempt to revise the permit for their marine terminal, as they want to more than double the number of oil tankers supplying crude oil to this refinery in San Francisco Bay. The sources for this crude oil, neither the refiner or the Bay Area Air Quality Management District have been really transparent in describing where this is going to come from. What we anticipate is clearly there's a growth in the export of tar sands crude to California. We have indications that this refinery is being further tooled to be able to manage this extra dirty source of crude oil. And then the other source that people should be very sensitive to is Arctic Alaska. And our assessment right now is that the cap and trade deal was set up in such a way here in California that it's providing political, business, and regulatory certainty for major fossil fuel interests that are interested in continuing to exploit new and being developed crude oil sources on the Arctic North Slope. This includes the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, looking out into the future, and any offshore drilling in the Arctic Ocean. So in conclusion, we think a debate around these matters is really, really important. Our organization is currently re-examining our position on carbon taxes. We are going to continue to participate in these debates. And the other thing that's really guiding us is our interest in responding to, assimilating, and really being attentive to the points of view of our environmental justice partners, our indigenous partners. We've worked very closely with the Indigenous Environmental Network and with our partners globally, who have continued to point out the risks and threats that these mechanisms present to communities on the front lines. So thank you so much for your attention. And again, thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight and for the organizers of the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gary. I'm going to pass it off to Andrea Miller to talk a little bit more about looking forward, some signs of hope, some cool stuff she's going to talk about. Again, just quickly, we are going to have time for a question or two at the end, and then we might stay a little bit later for folks that have some more questions. I know this is kind of a meaty, wonky topic, so we do appreciate all the questions coming in. If you are chatting your questions in, we have some experts who are answering some of them and talking through some of them as well. So again, just use that Q&A, and then after Andrea's done, we'll have a big question for our panelists, and then after the close at 9, some of us will stay on to keep answering some questions. Just to mention that the recording will have all of this, so if you need to hop off, we appreciate that and appreciate your time. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Andrea. Thanks so much to Gary from Friends of the Earth, and Andrea for People Demanding Action. Up next.
Thanks, Rebecca. And again, thanks to Food and Water Watch and all of the wonderful panelists that went before me. I get the wonderful task of talking about what a just and a good solution actually looks like on moving forward with clean, safe, renewable energy. Right now, we are looking at a situation where we have atmospheric cancer. Back in the 1970s, when we first discovered what was happening to our atmosphere, we can think about that as basically being stage 1. And our diagnosis was in the 1970s. We're basically now at stage 4, which other people have referred to as the climate tipping point. Anyone who has ever known anyone with cancer or unfortunately experienced it yourself, you know that the steps you take in stage 1 are very different than the steps you're going to need to take when you are in stage 4. We've done some talking about market-based solutions. There is one problem about market-based solutions when we are talking about human interest and human life. And that basically is the market is profit-driven. It wants to make its profit. And if there has been an investment in the past, they want to squeeze every possible penny out of that investment. I come from continuously being beaten up by Dominion Energy in Virginia. And believe me, they are motivated solely by profit. Whenever you talk to them and whenever they address the General Assembly, they are talking about, well, we've made this investment. Now, when we are talking about climate, when we are talking about clean air and clean water, we are talking about human interest, not market interest. As humans, we want long-term sustainable solutions. We are looking for investment in future technologies, and we are interested in the protection of vulnerable species. Notice I said species, and I didn't limit myself to people. There is an interconnectivity that exists with life on Earth. If we lose all the animals, that will drastically change what our life is like. What we need for 100% renewable energy. We need, actually, I should have added the word mandatory renewable portfolio standards. In Virginia, we've attempted to press Dominion to have mandatory renewable portfolio standards, and we have not been successful yet. We need energy efficiency. We need net metering, the ability for groups or individuals that can generate electricity and they generate more than they need to put that extra energy back into the grid. Community choice aggregation and community solar would also give us the ability to make a big difference. And when we talk about being able to lower energy costs and support frontline communities, this is something real. We need public financing. Right now, we provide public financing in the form of subsidies for the oil and gas industry. We need to get rid of those. And we need public financing as we make this transition, because again, we are talking about, in many places, building something that doesn't exist. Our transition must be just, meaning we don't want to create something wonderful for the wealthy communities, and then we leave the poorer communities to suffer with the garbage that is put out by dirty energy, which is unfortunately a lot of what happens when we talk about carbon pricing and cap and. Since we are not reducing pollution, we're just putting it in a place that's not in our neighborhood. This is not a just transition. And we need meaningful community input and analysis. Now, renewable portfolio standards, and we need to define what we mean by clean, good, renewable. We need enforceable standards, wind, solar, tidal, small-scale geothermal. What we mean by bad, trading, offsets, loopholes, and then things like garbage incinerators, biomass, agricultural waste, nuclear, hydrocarbon capture and sequestration, and again believing the market is going to somehow provide a solution. It does not. Now, public financing, tax credits. Everybody's heard of tax credits, so that is one way that we can begin to finance our transition. We can also use the PACE system, property assessed clean energy financing. People who own homes, own real estate, you pay property taxes. Wouldn't an investment in clean energy, clean air, and clean water help maintain your property's value? And then we need to establish clean energy funds. States have the ability to establish all types of funds. Why not a clean energy fund? Now, I'm assuming most people are reasonably familiar with net metering. The concept has been around for a while. I'm going to very quickly walk through community choice aggregation, meaning the municipality or the people within the community, they get together and they negotiate the price of energy on behalf of the residents, and they choose, this is really what is going to make the most sense for us. Are we going to do community solar? And then the bulk purchasing of the community, as opposed to individual buyers, helps lower the rates for everyone. Solar producers coming into a community like this because they can see what their customer base is going to be. And then we know that some municipalities will even build and sell clean energy directly to local residents and businesses. That wouldn't be Virginia, but there are some municipalities where this can happen. And then all of these things will provide access to the benefits of renewable energy to low-income people and renters. Because remember, people who rent are not paying property taxes, but they are energy users. Meaningful community input and analysis. Communities that are most impacted by the policy and the infrastructure decisions on energy must be at the table. Remember that old saying that if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu? This has happened for decades to frontline communities in many, many, many instances. And it is happening every day when we look at our energy and our infrastructure policy. Special efforts to engage traditionally underrepresented communities. This would be communities of color. This would be low-income communities. This would be rural communities. They are all energy users, have input. One of the things that happened in Pennsylvania is a judge ruled that if a company is fracking on one farm and they drill under another farm, that's trespassing. So people in rural America are waking up and they're saying, wait a minute, we need to have a say in how we are generating our energy. And we need to evaluate the social and the cumulative impacts in all of our energy sources. Now, one of the things that is very, very important to me is this notion that we can simply throw money at frontline communities and then continue to victimize them is in some way a progressive value. I actually normally say pay to poison is not a progressive value. Token revenues distributed to environmental justice communities from carbon trading, pricing, do not compensate, can never compensate for the destruction that happens in that community by the pollution and or the extraction. What is even worse about this is accepting such revenue not only doesn't compensate for the damage, it implicates the receiver in the extraction, pollution, and natural disasters that such pollution causes. We're all familiar now with very familiar with the Me Too movement and the whole notion of no means no. Well, no has to mean no when we're talking about pollution and dirtying up the air and the water of a community. When the community stands up and says no, that doesn't mean throw more money on the table and keep doing it. The solution that we have right now is the Off Fossil Fuels Act. It's HR 3671. It was introduced by Tulsi Gabbard. One of the first things that it does is it ends fossil fuel subsidies. There will be no federal permits for any new major fossil fuel projects after 2018 or whenever the legislation is passed. It prohibits exports of domestically produced crude oil and natural gas, including LNG. I spent 4 years fighting the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and one of the items in the TPP was so much of this fracked gas that we were going to produce was never going to be used in the United States. It was always going to be shipped internationally. We're establishing, or the bill establishes, the Center for Clean Energy Workforce Development within the Department of Labor, because we are going to need to transition the workers who have been working in dirty energy to clean energy. And a community assistance fund is established for specified industrial energy efficiency programs. Now, by 2035, the goal is 100% of electricity must be generated from clean energy resources. Again, you need to have a goal so that as organizationally, you can work backwards and plan where all of your points are to achieve the goal. If we're basically doing carbon trading and cap and whatever, there is no goal for when they stop using fossil fuels. They can just keep paying the poison. And again, remember, we're talking about some of the richest companies on the planet when we start talking about energy companies. 100% of vehicle sales from manufacturers must be zero-emission vehicles, and 100% of train rail lines and train engines must be electrified. So we are going to be working this month, since it is Earth Day, on putting together petitions, letters to the editors. We're going to be asking people to make congressional visits. Later on in the year, we'll probably do phone calls, but we are planning on having an email advocacy campaign launched by Earth Day. And there is also an Off Fossil Fuels pledge that many of the congressional candidates for 2018 have signed. In Virginia, when we had that incredible election result in 2017, the 15 newly elected and totally unexpected elected delegates had all signed a pledge not to take any money from Dominion. Dominion owns the Virginia legislature, they own the governor, basically they own everything. There's a reason why their name is not We Are Nice, Friendly, Around the Corner Energy Company. We are Dominion. So in order to break this, the people that we elect are going to have to be willing to not acquiesce and really fight fossil fuels. Thank you.
What a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Andrea, for going through all of that and really, I think, pointing to some really great solutions, some good calls to action. I do realize that we are a couple minutes past, but also that this is, kind of, again, like I said, quite a topic, and definitely highly anticipated for everyone to be here and kind of talk through these things. So thank you to all of the speakers. We will be sending this recording around, but we did have a couple questions that we wanted to just put out to the speakers and for everyone who joined, since we're all here together anyway. So if you do need to hop off, thank you so much. We want to, just respect your time. We will send around all that we go over. We're just going to do a couple questions. We're going to try to keep it to 9:15, just so our speakers know. So if you are answering something, try to keep it to your 25, 30 second pitch here. I'm going to start very quickly with kind of a broad question that a lot of folks have asked, and I think many of our panelists touched on, but one of the big ones is, so what? Carbon pricing is not perfect, but it's really what we have right now. And it seems at least to have a chance, it seems maybe to be politically feasible, maybe across the aisle as well. And if we stop this momentum, we may end up, with nothing to regulate them carbon. So, Scott, if you want to take a stab at it real quick, and then I know I ran into a little bit of Andrea's time, so I wanted to defer to Andrea as well to get a couple seconds on that question too.
Yeah, sure. Just very quickly. I mean, the danger of carbon pricing is it will preclude real solutions, and we saw this happen in California just last year, where in 2016 the law on the books said that starting in 2020, all sources in the electricity generating sector, all sources would have to have mandates for source by source emissions. No trading, none of this market stuff, no pretending you're reducing and buying credits. Because of the money that was raised off California's cap and trade program, Governor Brown and some of the big green groups, EDF and NRDC, pushed to reintroduce cap and trade in lieu of mandated source by source reductions, all because of the revenue raising. So, part of the problem is that states, governments get hooked on revenue and they want to raise revenue. We see this in Reggie states. And so they allow for the trading of pollution and the sale of pollution credits. And I'll just end by saying, I don't think anybody on this phone call or anybody in this webinar would think that we should be dealing with, for example, the lead crisis in Flint, Michigan, by putting a price on a pound of lead in children's drinking water, and then use that money to try to fix our water infrastructure in the years to come. We'd all be highly offended by that. We'd be poisoning our children. Well, we're poisoning our children with carbon right now, and we're poisoning this whole planet. So I'm not quite sure why we look at this differently and say, well, let's raise some revenue off of pricing pollution.
Yeah, and Andrea, could you speak to the idea of this bipartisanness in maybe even Virginia?
Well, when we talk about being bipartisan, the question becomes, what do you get? Do you get a real solution, or do you just get legislation that you pass that doesn't accomplish your objective? Our objective is to basically stop the warming of the planet and reverse the climate chaos that is occurring. We need to slow it down as quickly as possible. As I said, the whole notion of cap and carbon pricing could have been a good solution maybe back in the 70s and the 80s. It is not a solution now. We are past that as a real solution.
Great, thank you. And I want to pass it over to Tamara. We've had a lot of questions, and I think everyone really touched on this as well. But one of the big questions that came in was, how do we really craft these climate policies that will benefit low-income communities who are disproportionately burdened with pollution, lack of resources to make an investment in renewable energy? We see this with kind of individual change movements as well. And they might also have little political power to make sure that they're not left behind, right? We kind of talked about that traditional history. So just to you and to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think Andrea said it really clearly, when she said people need to be at the table, people need to have a voice, people need to be making the decisions. And the thing is that a lot of EJ communities have made decisions, and they do have voices, and they have solutions, and they're different. So I can't answer that with saying there's a one-size-fits-all solution for all communities that are suffering from climate justice and environmental justice issues, because different communities have different needs, there's different perspectives, and they're impacted by different types of fossil fuel use. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but as Andrea said earlier, making sure that people are at the table, that these initiatives are community-led, that these initiatives are led by people that are impacted first and most, that frontline communities are heard, because there are real solutions, and a lot of them are happening already as well. So it's not. So I don't want it to be shifted into this idea that there has to be some great big techno fix, or that there is a solution that comes from sort of an eco-modernist perspective. There are many solutions. They're happening already all the time, and it's really up to people who to start paying attention and listening and collaborating as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I really appreciate the critical lens at the solutions that people have in front of them, and from I know it's kind of sometimes an echo chamber of a lot of different solutions, and I think that's spot on, that they're all different and one size doesn't fit all.
And this is Gary from California, just to really quickly pitch in that we're really hoping that those who have been present from this webinar understand that what happened in California is that carbon pricing isn't just a tool in the toolbox anymore. It was legislated as the sole mechanism, for regulating greenhouse gases. So that's the exact opposite. Many people will talk about how we need to have all of our tools in the toolbox, and that debate can continue. But in California, the legislation was passed that eliminated the ability to use all of the other tools and made the market preeminent. And that is a false solution through and through.
Yeah. Gary, I was actually going to throw it to you next and just asked if you wanted to comment kind of on, people have been asking, Governor Brown is a climate champion, he's working on these things. Do you want to speak to any of that, or kind of that narrative?
Well, it's been a frustrating time with the governor. There's no question about it. I guess when we, are honest with ourselves about the Trump regime, as it were, and the climate science denial, it really is, I think, easy perhaps to take refuge in the fact that the California governor has correctly identified climate change as an existential threat. Unfortunately, what we found is that the governor has not been willing to base his policy proposals on the hardest climate science. So, the other thing with market mechanisms we try to point out to folks is that one of the defining characteristics of climate science denial is to choose and cherry pick from the science depending on political and economic considerations. And clearly it was the political and economic considerations that led the governor and many others to decide that this cap and trade model is what they really wanted to see be California's main climate policy mechanism out to 2030. So I would caution people to, just fall into a trap of thinking of Governor Brown as a global climate leader. I'm very critical of the governor, and at the same time, it is welcome that at least the governor is clearly willing to recognize climate change as a major risk to our children's future.
Perfect. Thanks for, definitely attacking that. I know it's a little bit past. I wanted to quickly, one last, pass it back to Andrea very quickly and just ask how do you think about Virginia moving forward, and will rejoining this coalition be the right step forward? I think you've answered that a little bit, but a number of folks asked that. So just to close on that point, and then I'll wrap us out.
Reggie is so not a solution for Virginia because of Dominion. Dominion purchased all of our wind leases, and we have zero wind energy. So when we look at Virginia, it really is a major battle against a corporate giant. They are unregulated, refuse to be regulated. And when we discovered or called them on the fact that because we could not monitor their rates, they simply said, okay, we'll give you $200 million, and then we're planning to raise the rates to recoup it. So when you look again at something like Reggie, because it doesn't demand that the pollution stop, it really is not a solution. We have our own version of the OFF Act in Virginia. It will be introduced again next year. We are on an education project to help people understand, like what we're doing tonight, the difference between pricing carbon and ending the use of fossil fuels.
Perfect. I think that's great. Again, I would just like to thank everyone for sticking with us. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, Andrea, for getting us in there in the end. Tamara, Gary, and Scott. As Andrea mentioned, we are all really working on this OFF Act, and we love to get everyone involved to work toward passing that. We have a national OFF Act, as well as a number of state bills. So you can go to offossilfuels.org to volunteer or get involved, work on that candidate pledge as well. There are a lot of elections coming up. We'd like to thank our allies and partners who have shared this webinar with their networks once again, and our speakers tonight. Shout outs to the Progressive Democrats of America, People Demanding Action, National Nurses United, People's Action, Friends of the Earth, and the Indigenous Environmental Network. And thank you to all of you for spending some time with us this evening. I hope we got to some of your questions. We want to continue this conversation and keep moving forward with great solutions, not false solutions, and reminding ourselves that paying to poison is not a progressive value. One of my favorite sayings from Andrea. So we really couldn't do it without all of you and without the incredible network of activists and allies. So that's it for tonight. Again, thank you for hanging in there, and thanks for joining us, and on to the clean energy revolution.